Footprints Without Feet is a story written by H.G. Wells, that is Herbert George Wells. Herbert George Wells was an English writer who died in 1946. He was prolific in many genres, writing dozens of novels. He has given many good novels, right? Short stories and works of social commentary, satire, biography, and autobiography. And even 2 books on the recreational war games also he has given. He is best remembered for his science fiction novels and is often called as the father of science fiction, right? So Herbert George, because he has given many books on science fiction, he is known as father of science fiction. Now, before we start reading the text, Footprints Without Feet, we have seen many documentaries. You must have seen few of the movies where the person has the ability to disappear, right? One such example of a movie is a very famous Hindi movie, Mr. India. If you remember, I've given you the example of this movie earlier also, right? So this is one such movie where the protagonist or the actor, the leading actor, he gets the opportunity, he gets this power to disappear himself, right? Now, this is a similar story, but in this story we find the central character who is a scientist by the name of Griffin. Griffin is a great scientist who has introduced or invented certain rare drugs. With the help of these drugs, he has the power to become transparent as a glass, right? So his body becomes absolutely invisible, but it is solid, right? Means the person, if somebody comes and touches them, he could ensure that somebody is there. But they cannot see the body, they cannot see it, but he is obviously solid like a glass, but transparent as a glass. But this man, Griffin, he is a lawless person. Means he is a corrupt man. He's not concerned about the society. He takes up all sort of wrong means to fulfill his desires, to fulfill his wishes. He's not that hardworking or a kind person who would take care of the society. Generous as such, he's not that kind of a person, right? So this is the story about Griffin, who has this power to disappear himself. How he disappears and what all he does after disappearing, what kind of problem he lands into, that is all we read in this story, right? So here is the screen in front of you. Paridhi, please start reading. You have to read the black section. There is no need to read the word meanings and the explanation which is in red. आपको सिर्फ black section read out करना है. ठीक है बेटा?
Okay, ma'am.
Please start reading from the 2 boys started in surprise.
The 2 boys started in surprise at the fresh muddy imprints of a pair of bare feet. What was a barefooted man doing on the steps of a house in the middle of London? And where was the man? As they gazed, a remarkable sight met their eyes. A fresh footmark appeared from nowhere. Further footprints followed him from one another, descending the steps and progressing down the street. The boys followed fascinated until the muddy impressions became fainter and fainter and at last disappeared altogether. The explanation of the mystery was really simple enough. The bewildered boys had been following a scientist who had just discovered how to make the human body transparent. Griffin, the scientist, had carried out an experiment after experiment to prove that the human body could become invisible. Finally, he swallowed certain rare drugs and his body became as transparent as a sheet of glass. Through it also remained as solid as glass. Brilliant scientist though he was, Griffin was rather a lawless person. His landlord disliked him and tried to eject him. In revenge, Griffin set fire to the house. To get away without being seen, he had to remove his clothes. Thus, it was that he became a homeless wanderer without clothes, without money, and quite invisible until he happened to step in some mud and left footprints as he walked.
Now, here the story begins. The story starts when two young boys in London noticed that there were footprints footprints on the mud, right? The strange part here was that the two boys saw the footprints of the barefoot, which were moving, right? One after the another in a sequence, the footprints were moving and they started following the footprints. But the strange thing was that the person to whom the footprints belonged, the body, the man, that was not visible. They could not see that. They were really fascinated by this thing and they followed the muddy impressions, but slowly the impressions became fainter and fainter, and at last the impressions disappeared altogether. Right? Now, the explanation of the mystery was really simple enough. What was it? The bewildered boys had been following a scientist. Bewildered means confused. The boys who were obviously, if anybody finds such a thing happening in front of them, footprints are there and the footprints are again and again formed. So, but you cannot see the person there. So you will be shocked. You will be bewildered. So the two boys were shocked. They had been following a scientist, but it was the truth was that they were following a scientist who had discovered how to make human body transparent. The name of the scientist, as I told you, was Griffin. He had carried out an experiment after experiment to prove that the human body could become invisible. Finally, he swallowed certain rare drugs. And his body became as transparent as a sheet of glass, though it was solid also. Now, though Griffin was a very brilliant scientist, but he was a corrupt man, his landlord disliked him, right? And he tried to eject him, and the landlord wanted to throw him out of the house. So, in order to take revenge from the landlord, what Griffin did, you can imagine what kind of a man he was. He wanted to take revenge from the landlord, so he put set landlord's house on fire, right? Now, obviously, he wanted to get away without being noticed that who had done this. Otherwise, he would be caught by the police. He would be behind the bars. So, in order to escape this thing, he removed his clothes and he became invisible. As a result, he was now a homeless wanderer without clothes, without money, and completely invisible until he happened to step in some mud and left footprints as he walked. So, he was absolutely invisible till the time he was walking on the mud, and then only his footprints became visible, right? So I hope the story is clear till this point.
मुझे दिखाई मुझे दिखाई मुझे दिखा
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, let's move
दीक्षा
on.
मुझे दिखाई चलो तो
Paridhi, please continue.
Yes, ma'am. He escaped easily enough from the boys who followed his footprints in London, but his adventures were by no means over. He had chosen a bad time of the year to wander about London without clothes. It was midwinter, the air was bitterly cold, and he could not do without clothes. Instead of walking about the streets, he decided to slip into a big London store for warmth. Closing time arrived, and as soon as the doors were shut, Griffin was able to give himself the pleasure of clothing and feeding himself without regard to expense. He broke open boxes and wrappers and fitted himself out with warm clothes. Soon, with shoes, an overcoat, and a wide brimmed hat, he became a fully dressed and visible person. In the kitchen of the restaurant, he found cold meat and मैम ये यहाँ पर
हाँ बेटा बोलो.
he found cold meat and coffee, and he followed up the meal with sweets and wine taken from grocery store. Finally, he settled down to sleep on a pile of quilts. If only Griffin had managed to wake up in good time, only all might have been well. As it was, he did not wake up until the assistants were already arriving next morning. When he saw a couple of them approaching, he panicked and began to run. They naturally gave chase. In the end, he was able to escape only by quickly taking off his newly found clothes. So once more, he found himself invisible but naked in the chilly January air.
Now, this was just the beginning of the adventure. When the two boys had seen his footprints on the mud and he had ran away, gradually he became disappeared, right? Then he set fire on the landlord's house. in order to take revenge. Now it was a time of extreme winter. It was the winter season in London. Because of setting landlord's house on fire, he had to make himself invisible, right? He was without clothes, because if he's wearing clothes, then his clothes, the shape of his body would become visible. Though the face, the body part would be invisible, but because he'll be wearing clothes, so somewhere would become, the body would become visible, right? The shape of the clothes would become visible. So in order that he would not be noticed by anybody, now he was wandering naked on the streets of London. It was extremely cold, it was chilly winter, and in that season, moving on the streets without clothes was really a tough thing for him. So instead of walking about the streets, he decided to slip into a big London store for warmth. So he moved inside into a big London store. Obviously, he was invisible, so he was not noticed. Closing time arrived. Now it was closing time. So as soon as the doors were shut, Griffin was able to give himself the pleasure of clothing. So Griffin wore all kinds of warm clothes, overcoats, hats, and everything. He opened the boxes and wrappers and fitted himself with warm clothes, soon with the shoes and overcoat and a wide-brimmed hat. Now he became a fully dressed and visible person to the kitchen of the restaurant, visible person. And then he moved towards the kitchen of the restaurant. He found cold meat and coffee. He found meat himself, coffee for himself, followed up with a meal, sweets, and wine taken from the grocery store. So from the grocery, it was a supermarket kind of a store. So he had all the eatables there. He fed himself well. He drank from the grocery store. And then finally, it was sleeping time. So he settled down on a pile of quilts. Quilts ki pile pe he slept down to make himself warm and comfortable. Now, if Griffin had got up early next morning, then there was no trouble. But the problem here arose because Griffin was still sleeping on the pile of the quilts when it was the time to open the store. So now the assistants were there, and they found that the boxes were opened up, and they found that a shape of clothes was lying on the quilts. Though they cannot see the face, as you can see in the picture, but there was a body in the form of clothes. So when he saw a couple of them approaching, he panicked and started running. So he ran towards the street again. They naturally gave chase, so everybody chased him. But in the end, he was able to escape only by quickly taking off his newly found clothes. So he was able to save himself by taking away the clothes. So again, he was naked in the chilly winter on the streets of London. So once more, he found himself invisible but naked in the chilly January air. I hope it's clear till this point. Any doubts? Any part which is not clear?
Ma'am,
No,
clear.
ma'am. Clear है.
And what is the meaning of
ठीक है.
quilt?
Quilt, जिसको आप blanket बोलते हो. That's thin blanket is known as quilt. आपने सुना होगा AC quilts are there. That is a quilt,
Okay,
which are
ma'am.
taken
This time,
over yourself to keep
this
yourself
time,
warm. That is quilt. Just a second.
This time, he decided to try the stock of a theatrical company in the hope of finding not only clothes but also something that would hide the empty space above his shoulders. Shivering with cold, he hurried to Drury Lane, the center of the theatre world. He soon found a suitable shop. He made his way invisible upstairs and came out a little later wearing bandages around his forehead, dark glasses, false nose, big bushy side whiskers, and a large hat. To escape without being seen, he carelessly attacked the shopkeeper from behind, after which he robbed him of all the money he could find. Eager to get away from crowded London, he took a train to the village of Iping, where he booked 2 rooms at the local inn. The arrival of a stranger at an inn in winter was in any case an unusual event. A stranger of such uncommon appearance set all tongues wagging. Mrs. Halls, the landlord's wife, made every effort to be friendly, but Griffin had no desire to talk and told her, "My reason for coming to Iping is a desire for solitude. I do not wish to be disturbed in my work. Besides, an accident has affected my face." Satisfied that her guest was an eccentric scientist, and in view of the fact that he had paid her in advance, Mrs. Hall was prepared to excuse his strange habits and irritable temper. But the stolen money did not last long, and presently Griffin had to admit. Ma'am, it is not visible.
Okay. Now we have reached a point where the man was, after coming back from that store, he realized that he was naked again, right? So now the man decided to do something by which he would be invisible and not be noticed by anybody. So this time he decided to try the stock of a theatrical company. So he went to a theater company and Drury Lane, which was a hub of this theater world. So he went there and he entered into a shop from where he could get all these things to hide himself. So because he was invisible, he was naked. So he went upstairs without anybody noticing him. And then he came out a little later wearing bandages around his forehead, dark glasses, false nose, big bushy side whiskers, and a large hat. So all these things he was wearing. Whiskers is a long projecting hair, long hair of like being not noticed. For that the reason so that he could not be noticed, right? So he wore all these things and he came downstairs. Now because he was wearing all these things, now the shape of him was visible, right? So to escape without being seen, he attacked the shopkeeper, robbed him of all the money what all he had, and then he came out from the crowded London without being noticed, and he took a train to the village of Iping. Iping was a place. He went to that place. He took a train to that village. Now, we can imagine what kind of a man he was. He was obviously a corrupt man. No, he was not a nice person. As he set the his landlord's house on fire in order to take revenge. Now, he had robbed the shopkeeper because he had taken all his belongings from the shop to hide his identity, and he has robbed him of his money also. Now when he goes to Ipin in order to take shelter, he was dressed up in all kind of the things from which he could hide his face. Obviously he was invisible, but that thing looked very much weird that he was wearing clothes but the face was not there, hands were not there, the cuffs were there but the hands were not there. So now he was wearing all kind of things by which he could hide himself, right? So he took a train and he reached Iping. There he went into an inn. Inn is a hotel. So there he entered into an inn. Mrs. Hall, who was the landlord's wife, the owner of the inn, right? She tried to be very friendly with Griffin, but Griffin had no desire to talk, and Griffin told her, see, that my reason to come here to Iping was that I want to spend some time alone. I'm here with a desire for solitude. Solitude means being alone. He wanted to be alone and he wanted to focus on his work. He told her that his face was affected by by an accident, so his face was like that. So he has hidden his face, and he was an eccentric scientist. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Hall, they grew suspicious. Imagine a person entering into your home or in front of you, but you cannot see his face. So obviously, you will find it very strange. So they found it strange, but they realized that he was a scientist and he had paid them in advance. So they were okay with the irritable temper and the strange habits also of Griffin. Now, but the stolen money did not up. Now he had paid him advance. They paid them the advance for the as a rent of the house. But the stolen money did not long last. And presently, Griffin had to admit that he had no more ready cash. So after some time, he accepted in front of the inn owners that now I do not have any cash, and I'm expecting a check. As soon as I receive a check, receive my money, I'm going to clear your dues. Now,
Excuse me, ma'am.
yes, please.
Ma'am, Sia is in the waiting room.
Just a second, please. ठीक है. Who was reading the it? अभी कौन पढ़ रहा था?
Ma'am, I was reading.
ठीक है बेटा, start करो. You have to start from shortly afterwards a curious episode occurred.
Okay, ma'am. Shortly afterwards, a curious episode occurred. Very early in the morning, a clergyman and his wife were awakened by noises in the study. Creeping downstairs, they heard the chink of money being taken from the clergyman's desk without making any noise, and with the poker grasped firmly in his hand, the clergyman flung open the door, surrender.
Now, this was again a curious episode. See, the thing was that Griffin had to pay money to the inn owners. The inn in which he was staying, he had to pay money to them. You remember? Just now I told you that he told them that I'm expecting a check. So as soon as I receive my check, I will give you the money. I'll give you the rent, right? But now what he has to do, he had to rob somebody to get the money. So he went to a clergyman's house, and both clergyman and his wife, they were sleeping at night time. It was night and they were sleeping. So he stole their money. So they were disturbed by the chink of the money, the sound of the money coins maybe. They were disturbed by that. So they entered into the study to check who was it. And they were really surprised to find that the money was stolen, but they could not catch anybody because the man was not there. Means it was Griffin. So Griffin had made himself invisible. So to his amazement, the clergyman described this event as an extraordinary affair, but he could not help it out. So his entire money was gone. Griffin had stolen the money in front of him. चलिए please continue करो बेटा. Then to his amazement.
Okay, ma'am. Then, to his amazement, he realized that the room appeared to be empty. He and his wife looked under the desk and behind the curtains and even up the chimney. There wasn't a sign of anybody. Yet the desk had been opened and the housekeeping money was missing. Extraordinary affair, the clergyman kept saying for the rest of the day. But it was not as extraordinary as the behavior of Mrs. Hall's furniture a little later that morning. The landlord and his wife were up very early and were surprised to see the scientist's door wide open. Usually it was shut and locked, and he was furious if anyone entered his room. The opportunity seemed too good to be missed. They peeped round the door, saw nobody, and decided to investigate. The bedclothes were cold, showing that the scientist must have been up for some time, and stranger still, the clothes and bandages that he always wore were lying about the room. All of a sudden, Mrs. Hall heard a sniff close to her ear. A moment later, the hat on the bedpost leapt up and dashed itself into her face. Then the bedroom chair became alive. Springing into the air, it charged straight at her legs foremost. As she and her husband turned away in terror, the extraordinary chair pushed them both out of the room and then appeared to slam and lock the door after them. Mrs. Hall almost fell down the stairs in hysterics. She was convinced that the room was haunted by spirits and that the stranger had somehow caused these to enter into her furniture. My poor mother used to sit in that chair, she moaned. To think it should rise up against me now. The feeling among the neighbors was that the trouble was caused by witchcraft. But
Now
witchcraft or
better wait. Let me explain till this point. Now, so after the clergyman was robbed, right? He told it was an extraordinary affair, but he could not help it out. His entire money was taken away by Griffin. Now, meanwhile, when Griffin had gone to the clergyman's house to rob him, he had forgotten to shut the door of his inn, of his hotel room. Mr. and Mrs. Hall, who were the landlords of the inn, they were already suspicious about Griffin, right? Whose face was not visible, though they knew that he was an eccentric scientist. Now, they took it as an opportunity that they found that the door of the room was wide open and there was nobody inside the room, right? So they peeped round the door and they wanted to investigate. When they entered into the room, they realized that the bedclothes were cold, means nobody slept on that bed sheet that day, that night. And the clothes and the bandages which the scientist Griffin used to wear, they were lying on the bed. So all of a sudden, Mrs. Hall heard a sniff close to her ear. Suddenly, Mrs. Hall heard somebody giving her a blow at the ear. A moment later, the hat on the bedpost leapt up and dashed itself into her face. So a moment later, the hat which was there on the bedside, that was dashed on Mrs. Hall's face. Who was doing it? Imagine all of a sudden a hat rises up and it is thrown at at somebody. So who is doing it?
Ma'am Griffin.
Ma'am Griffin.
Yes, because Griffin was invisible. He had removed all its clothes to become invisible to go to the clergyman's house in order to rob him. Now he was back. When he comes back, though he's still invisible, he finds that Mr. and Mrs. Hall are inside his room and they are investigating. So obviously he was angry. So in order to punish them, he throws the hat on her face. And then the bedroom chair became alive. Now the bedroom chair became alive. The springing into the air, it charged straight at her legs foremost. So he threw the chair in front of Mrs. Hall. Now Mrs. Hall did not know what was going on. She found that the furniture was flying, somebody was throwing upon her, but she could not realize what was wrong. So as she and husband turned away in terror, they were scared. The extraordinary chair pushed them both out of the room. So the chair was flying in the air and the chair pushed both of them out of the room, right? And then appeared to slam and lock the door after them. So when they both of them were out, so the door was slammed and the door was locked from inside. Means the Griffin had pushed them out of the room, out of his room, and he had shut the door. Mrs. Hall almost fell down the stairs in hysterics. Hysterics is like shock. So she was almost fainting because of the shock. She was convinced that the room was haunted by spirits and the stranger had somehow caused these to enter into her furniture. So she was now convinced that there was some sort of spirits and this stranger has brought that spirits into the furniture also. She was moaning, she was crying that my mother used to sit on that chair and to think it should rise up against me now. And she was thinking that maybe mother was now against her. The spirit of the mother was harming her. The feeling among the neighbor was also that the trouble was caused by the witchcraft. There was some sort of magic, black magic or witchcraft, something was there that was creating that trouble. So people have different notions. If anything of this sort starts happening, it's very strange, it's very weird. So people have their own ideas, opinions, what all is going about. Please continue, beta. Zara jaldi se kar lo ye wala stanza. But witchcraft.
Okay, ma'am. But witchcraft or not, when news of the burglary at the clergyman's home became known, the strange scientist was strongly suspected of having had a hand in it. Suspicion grew even stronger when he suddenly produced some ready cash, though he had admitted not long before that he had no money. The village constable was secretly sent for. Instead of waiting for the constable, Mrs. Halls went to the scientist, who had somehow mysteriously appeared from his empty bedroom. I want to know what you have been doing to my chair upstairs, she demanded. And I want to know how it is you came out of an empty room and how you entered a locked room.
Now, obviously, Mrs. Hall was growing more suspicious, whether it was witchcraft or whatever it was. But the news of the burglary of the clergyman also became known to everybody, and the strange scientist who was strongly suspected of having had a hand in it. Now, suspicion grew even stronger when suddenly produced some ready cash. Now, the suspicion was now more stronger when he produced cash in front of Mrs. Hall, because just few days back he had told Mrs. Hall that I have no money to give it to you right now. Now he was giving money, right? And he had admitted not long that he had no money. So the village constable was called upon. Instead of waiting for the constable, now Mrs. Hall, we realize she's a suspicious lady, but she is always very anxious to know. Like she peeped into his room. Now she was again very anxious to know what was going on. So instead of waiting for the constable, Mrs. Hall went to the scientist who had somehow appeared from his empty bedroom. Now obviously it was very strange because when they were pushed out by the chair, the room was empty. The Griffin was, and these people, they cannot find their visitor Griffin there. The Griffin was there, but because he was invisible, so उनके लिए अभी और shocking था कि empty bedroom में से how Griffin is coming out, right? So Mrs. Hall walked up to Griffin and she asked him, I want to know what you have been doing to my chair upstairs. And she said that how you came out of an empty room and how you entered into a locked room. How is this possible? Right? So she was growing suspicious. Is the story clear to everybody till this point?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
It's
ma'am.
an interesting one,
Yes,
so
ma'am.
I'm going to further continue the story